If you wander into St. Francis of Assisi Church at Baddesley, Clinton, the place where the Ferrers family once sheltered so many hunted priests, you will find a fresco of Anne Vaux. Her face is soft, almost serene, but the expression is unmistakably alert. It's a look of someone who understands secrets, someone who has spent a lifetime managing danger. And what makes Anne so interesting is that she didn't spring out of nowhere. She was the product of a family that had been weaving itself through English politics since the tail end of the Middle Ages, always tied to the losing side and somehow always managing to survive the fallout. Today, we are going to talk about the Vaux family. Hey friend, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, the original Tudor history podcast telling stories of Tudor England since 2009. I am your host, Heather, and I am delighted, as always, that you are choosing to spend this time with me today to talk about the Vaux family. I've been wanting to talk about them for some time. A couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, actually, there was that BBC drama Gunpowder about the Gunpowder Plot, and the Vauxes, of course, were prominent in that. And it really made me want to dig into them. But now as we're doing this kind of survey of noble families this past year, they pop up more and more being married to different people, of course. And so I thought it's time that we did an episode just on them. So let's dig in. Before we get to Anne, we need to back up a little bit. About a century before Anne was slipping messages written in orange juice into the Tower of London to a woman named Katherine Peniston, or Panizzone, depending on which chronicler you're trusting. Katherine was the daughter of a Piedmontese gentleman connected to King René of Anjou. That alone already tells you she didn't come from some quiet country family. She grew up in the orbit of two courts, the European world of Provence and Piedmont, and later the English court of Margaret of Anjou, who of course married the Lancastrian King Henry VI. Katherine arrived in England as part of Margaret's entourage, a household that would become one of the most embattled political circles of the entire 15th century. Unlike many courtiers who drift with the wind, Katherine held on, and she married William Vaux of Harrowden, a solidly loyal Lancastrian gentleman. They were newly married when everything fell apart around them. In 1461, after Yorkist victories, William Vaux was attainted, stripped of lands, titles, and rights. For a small gentry family, that should have been the end of things, but Katherine simply refused to let go of the people that she served. When Margaret of Anjou was dragged into the Tower after the catastrophe of Tewkesbury in 1471, Katherine stayed by her side. Her husband was actually killed in that battle. Her family's future was shattered. But she remained with the defeated queen, caring for her through her imprisonment and then following her again into exile when Margaret was finally released after her ransom was paid in late 1475, early 1476. And this is where the pattern begins. A Vaux is always loyal to someone, even if that loyalty is politically disastrous. While Katherine was living in prisons and exile with her queen, her children, Nicholas and his sister Joan, were not sent abroad with her. Instead, they were placed into the household of none other than Lady Margaret Beaufort, the future King Henry VII's mother. Lady Margaret paid for their upbringing, quote, without charge, which is the medieval equivalent of saying, these children are now under my protection. It's an extraordinary detail, one that says a lot about how the Tudor dynasty viewed those who had remained faithful to the Lancastrian cause. So here we have Katherine Peniston, clinging to a defeated queen with the kind of steadfastness that would become a family trait. And you have her children being raised in the household that produced Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. The Vauxes were stitched into both tragedy and opportunity from the very beginning. And by the time the Tudors take power, you have two generations of Vauxes, shaped by exile, reversals, rescue, and political recalibration. That's the stage on which the next generation, Nicholas Vaux, steps out. He is the hinge between their medieval past and their Tudor rise, and he sets the tone for everything that comes later, including Anne's recusant world. When Henry Tudor won Bosworth in 1485, plenty of Loyalists lined up to collect their rewards, but few had a clearer claim to royal gratitude than young Nicholas Vaux. His father, of course, had died fighting for the Lancastrian cause back when Henry was still in exile in Brittany. His mother had cared for Margaret of Anjou when even her own English allies abandoned her. And Nicholas himself had been raised in the household of Lady Margaret Beaufort, which was basically the beating heart of the Tudor operation. So when Henry VII reversed the attainder against William Vaux in that first triumphant parliament, he wasn't just restoring property. He was restoring a family the Tudors viewed as theirs. Nicholas Vaux grew up during Yorkist rule, which means he learned early how to keep his head down. But once Henry VII was on the throne, Nicholas steps into full view. His career reads like a checklist of Tudor loyalty. He fights for Henry at Stoke in 1487, the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. He's there again at Blackheath in 1497 when Cornish rebels threaten London. He's knighted on the field more than once, which is actually unusual and suggests real competence, not ceremonial courtesy. But Nicholas isn't just a military figure. Oh, no. Henry VII uses him in diplomacy, especially with Burgundy and France. He is the kind of man that you send to look solid and trustworthy in a negotiation. He's not flashy or reckless. He's also a frequent presence at court, one of those figures who drifts through the background of great state events in the early Tudor reign. He's present, reliable, and unremarkable in the very best possible way. And then comes Henry VIII, whose court life ramps every occasion up several notches. We know that in 1511, Henry VIII visited the Vaux family seat at Harrowden Hall. Now, hosting a king wasn't just about putting out your best silver. It meant being trusted to handle the logistics of royal security, food supplies, and entertainment. Harrowden, at least in that moment, was firmly part of the Tudor social map. Nicholas's most significant public moment came in 1520 at the Field of Cloth of Gold. If you ever wanted a snapshot of the Vaux family during their Tudor Golden Age, picture Nicholas and his second wife, Anne Green, standing amid the glittering chaos of that Anglo-French spectacle. Henry VIII is wrestling, there are jousts, enormous banquets, all playing out under the tents of literal cloth of gold. Nicholas is one of the event's organizers. He's responsible for the logistics of the English presence. His sister Joan is there too, serving in the Queen's household. The Vauxes aren't spectators. They are staff-level insiders. His marriages also deepen the family's connection. His first wife, Elizabeth Fitzhugh, was niece to Cecily Neville and the widow of William Parr of Kendal. That made Nicholas stepfather to the Parr children, placing him in the extended kinship network of Katherine Parr, who of course became Henry VIII's sixth queen. After Elizabeth's death, Nicholas married Anne Green, the daughter of Thomas Green of Boughton, another Central Midlands family. Their children, including Thomas Vaux, would inherit both land and the web of elite connections that Nicholas built with his quiet, methodical efficiency. By the time he died in 1523, Nicholas Vaux had transformed the family from loyal Lancastrian remnants into established Tudor insiders. He's the bridge, the man who turns Lancastrian suffering into Tudor stability. But the seeds of the next Vaux transformation, Catholic conservatism, recusancy, and political danger, are already planted. His son, Thomas, will carry the family in a new direction. So Thomas inherited all of the titles and estates, and he could not have been more different from his father. Nicholas, like we said, is the sort of man that kings rely on. He's competent, loyal, and practical. Thomas, on the other hand, is part of that new generation of Tudor courtiers who drift between martial service and literary expression. He was a friend of Sir Thomas Wyatt and part of the poetic circle around Henry VIII's early court. His work appears in Totel's Miscellany, that first great printed anthology of English verse. He wasn't a household name like Wyatt, but he was respected, and more importantly, he represents a shift in the family's posture. Thomas was not politically ambitious. He wasn't clawing for office. Instead, he kept his distance from the harder edges of Henry VIII's religious revolution. There's a quiet conservatism in his poems, especially the ones on mortality and the fleeting nature of courtly life. And while plenty of courtiers kept their Catholic sympathies tucked just out of sight during the 1530s and 40s, Thomas seems to have done so more out of temperament than just defiance. He just wasn't a zealot for reform. His marriage also reinforces this quieter, conservative strain. His wife was Elizabeth Cheney, and she came from the tangled Parr-Fitzhugh-Cheney network that already connected the Vauxes to Catherine Parr's extended family. These were households with long histories and complicated loyalties, not the newly minted men who benefited most from Henry VIII's break with Rome. Thomas died in 1556, just a couple of years into Mary I's reign, at a time when the restoration of Catholicism made families like the Vauxes suddenly respectable again. But his early death meant that the Vaux fortune and responsibilities fell to his son William, who would have to survive Elizabeth I's very different religious landscape. If Nicholas Vaux represents the family's Tudor rise and Thomas is the thoughtful literary middle, then William, the third Baron, is the man who turns the Vauxes into something else entirely, one of the most prominent recusant families in England. William inherited in 1556, the same year that Mary Tudor officially restored Catholic worship. For a moment, the Vauxes were aligned with the state again. But Mary died in 1558, and everything changed. The new queen, Elizabeth, was Protestant, cautious, and increasingly intolerant of households that refused to conform. And William Vaux did not conform. Not quietly, not half-heartedly. Instead, he raised a large, openly Catholic family at Harrowden Hall, including daughters Anne and Eleanor and sons Edward and Henry, and a wide network of cousins, including the Treshams. His household became a center of Catholic resistance, not rebellion, but insistence. Mass was said, priests were sheltered, and recusancy fines began to stack up. These fines were not minor inconveniences, they were actually ruinous. William spent much of his life under government scrutiny, facing seizures of property and repeated searches. Harrowden Hall became one of those places county officials visited with the assumption that a priest was hiding somewhere in an attic. But William didn't run his household like a furtive conspirator. He ran it like a man who believed the crown was wrong and his duty was to God first. And his children grew up in that atmosphere. Wealthy and educated, but schooled in secrecy and courage, and the kind of stubborn Catholic pride that the Elizabethan regime simply could not break. By the time William died in 1595, the Vaux family had completed a transformation. They were no longer Tudor insiders, but they also weren't rebels either. And his daughters, Anne and Eleanor, took that upbringing and turned it into a life mission. And this is where the Vaux story stops being a tale of a Tudor rise and becomes something far more dangerous. Before we get into the next part, though, I do want to give a quick shout out to some new patrons. Thank you and hello to Kathleen, to Gerald, Alice, and Julie. Also, over on YouTube, I don't necessarily have all of your names because it just shows your username, but hey to Mon Still, to Katie Emerald, PJ with a lot of Z's, that Witch Aurora, Corin Calendo, Tony Lynn, Jose Vasperglass, Rebecca, Karen, Okie Jammer, who's been leaving me some amazing comments over on YouTube. Thank you so much. Bathtub Jen, which I absolutely love that name because I also love a good bathtub. Melinda, there's Butterfly Bye, also Becky, Scarlett O'Hara's over there, and Jen, and Auntie Danny Lynn. I think I caught all of them. If I have missed you, apologies. I will try to catch it next time. Of course, if you join as a member or over on Patreon, there's extra content. We're going through the history of France from English eyes this year. Next year, we're going to be doing another country. There's discounts on my merch and all the programs I do, author chats, all kinds of good stuff. So you can go to patreon.com/EnglandCast to find out more about that. And thank you so very much to those of you who do support this podcast, however you do it. I am so very, very grateful to you. All right, let's get back to it. By the late 1590s, the Vaux name had a very different meaning than it did during Nicholas's Tudor heyday. In Jacobean imagination, the family eventually became linked to whispers of conspiracy and hidden chambers. But at that time, the real work was far more domestic and far more dangerous. It was carried out by two sisters, Anne Vaux and Eleanor Brooksby. Anne and Eleanor were the daughters of William Vaux, raised in a household where Catholic priests came and went so regularly that the rhythms of illegal worship would have felt normal to them. They grew up knowing when to blow out candles, how to respond politely to a government officer without giving anything away, and how to maintain a sense of calm during a search of the house. Their father's recusancy fines had taught them early that resistance was part of everyday life. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. Their partnership as adults is one of the most interesting aspects of the Vaux family story. Eleanor married and became Mistress Brooksby, but her marriage did not dull her Catholic convictions. Anne never married, which meant that she had the legal and financial freedom to move properties around, rent safe houses, and supervise households without the interference of a husband. Together, the sisters became two of the most important supporters of the underground Jesuit mission. One of their most active properties was Whiteweb's, a secluded house in Enfield Chase. Its isolation made it ideal for secret meetings. Even before the Gunpowder Plot, Whiteweb's had a reputation for being too quiet. Neighbors noticed odd comings and goings. The house's occupants were mostly women, maids, housekeepers, and Anne Vaux herself. But the men who visited were always suspiciously discreet. Among them were Robert Catesby, Thomas Bates, and occasionally Francis Tresham, the Vaux's cousin whose involvement in the Gunpowder Plot would later become impossible to ignore. Anne's devotion, however, was not to political radicals. Her loyalty centered on Father Henry Garnet, the Jesuit superior in England. Garnet wasn't a hothead or a rebel. He spent decades trying to keep English Catholics out of conspiracies, urging both caution and obedience to the crown. Anne adored him. Their relationship was spiritual, intense, and emotionally close, although not in a romantic sense. She managed safe houses for him, protected him, and provided resources so that he could minister to English Catholics without being immediately arrested. Their other major base was at Baddesley Clinton, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and nearby Brooksby Hall, estates connected to their Ferrers and Brooksby relatives. These houses were part of a larger Midlands recusant network that included the Throckmortons of Coton Court and the Treshams of Rushton. Anyone tracing the geography of the Catholic underground ends up circling these properties repeatedly. The Vaux sisters were right at the center of that map. Picture a night at one of these houses. The shutters closed early, a guest room prepared for a cousin from the country, and a narrow priest hole, probably designed by Nicholas Owen, ready to swallow a man whole if the pursuivants arrived. Anne and Eleanor weren't passive hostesses. They were managing security, logistics, and communication. Their households acted like miniature resistance cells, but without the glamour of rebellion, just constant vigilance and thinking. By 1605, when the Gunpowder plotters began whispering about something bold that might turn the tide for English Catholics, Anne sensed immediately the trouble was brewing. She was close enough to hear the outlines of conspiracy, but wise enough to keep Garnet away from it as long as she could. But despite her caution, the Vaux sisters would soon be caught in the gravitational pull of that most famous failed plot in English history. So we're in the autumn of 1605, and Anne Vaux is uneasy. She wasn't a conspirator, and she didn't support violence. She was the sort of Catholic who spent her resources keeping priests alive, not blowing up parliaments. But she had eyes, and she had instincts. Robert Catesby had started visiting Whiteweb's too frequently. There were whispered meetings in upper rooms. Some of the men carried themselves with that brittle energy that people get when they've convinced themselves that they're about to save the country. Anne warned Father Garnet repeatedly that something reckless was coming, and Garnet tried to avoid entanglement. But Catesby had already set the wheels in motion. When the Monteagle letter appeared, the anonymous warning telling Lord Monteagle to stay away from Parliament, the entire fragile structure of the plot began collapsing. No one to this day knows who wrote it. Some contemporaries suspected Francis Tresham, who had both motive and connections. Others have pointed at Anne Vaux, mainly because of perceived similarities in handwriting. But the evidence is thin, and the idea that Anne would risk blowing her own safe house network is hard to reconcile with everything else that she did. Either way, once the plotters fled, Anne found herself right in the middle of the government's dragnet. She was arrested within days, questioned intensely, but not with the same violence used on the plotters. She was, after all, a woman with money and status, and the government believed she was more a facilitator than a schemer. She was released on bond, but the real work was still ahead. Father Henry Garnet had gone to Hindlip Hall, the notorious recusant stronghold belonging to Thomas Addington. Hindlip was famous for priest holes, intricate, cramped hideaways constructed by Nicholas Owen, the Jesuit master builder whose secret chambers could conceal a man from soldiers standing only inches away. I've done a video on his priest holes on YouTube. I'll link to it below. Anne attempted to reach Garnet there and arrange his protection. Instead, she walked straight into a siege. Government searchers arrived, and Hindlip became the scene of one of the most dramatic priest hunts in English history. Men were hidden for days in suffocating darkness while officers smashed through walls and lifted floorboards. Garnet was eventually discovered at the end of January in 1606. Anne made her way to London soon after, determined to maintain some link with him. The only method available was risky, slipping messages into letters passed through Garnet's jailer. She wrote them using orange juice as an invisible ink, a trick known to Catholic agents but really tricky to master. The writing was faint, and Garnet later complained that he could scarcely read it. Modern researchers have pointed out that the issue wasn't her eyesight or her punctuation. Invisible ink simply looked patchy unless you're really skilled at it. Unfortunately, the letters were intercepted and handed straight to Robert Cecil. Anne was arrested in March. This round of interrogation was far more serious, but even then, the government couldn't tie her directly to conspiracy. She admitted to knowing the plotters and to sheltering priests, but not to treason. She was released in August and allowed to retreat and live out her life in the quieter shadows of the Midlands. After her sister Eleanor's death, Anne moved to Stanley Grange in Derbyshire. She founded a small school for boys from Catholic noble families, exactly the sort of activity that the Protestant authorities loved to shut down. They tried to close it in 1635, but didn't fully succeed. Anne disappeared from the record sometime after 1637. As for the Vaux legacy, it didn't end with her. Her brother Edward became the fourth Baron Vaux. The title eventually fell into abeyance in the 1660s and then resurfaced in the 19th century, and then again in the 20th. One of her descendants, Father Gabriel Gilby, became the first Benedictine monk to take his seat in the House of Lords since the 1550s. It's the sort of coda that would have amused Anne, a family once fined into exhaustion for hearing Mass, now sending a monk into Parliament in plain sight. And that really is the shape of the Vaux story, a family that survived exile, Yorkist vengeance, Tudor pageantry, Elizabethan pressure, Jacobean suspicion, and the long, cold years of recusancy. A family that kept adjusting while keeping the same streak of stubborn loyalty that began with Katherine Peniston following a defeated queen into exile. And through it all, Anne Vaux stands out not because she plotted, but because she protected, she resisted, and she refused to disappear. So there we have it, my friend, a little bit about the Vaux story. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please go ahead and press that like button wherever you're listening to this. Send it to a friend who also might enjoy it as well. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Thank you for your listenership. You can always hop into the Tudor Learning Circle, tudorlearningscircle.com. It's a social network just for Tudor nerds. That's always fun. I will be back next week with a full episode, and I'll see you on YouTube in the meantime. All right, my friend, have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, send who may be sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbrick, dat soll is